5 decades ago, the landscape of our province looked very different than it does today. It was the late 1960s. Newfoundland and Labrador was still adjusting to life as a Canadian province. Many coastal settlements were only accessible by water. We rode on dirt roads that were often treacherous and impassable most of the year. The entire per capita income was only half of the rest of Canada's, and in our fishing communities, it was often worse. Fishing was hard and given little value in a fishery dominated by merchant control. Traditionally, men worked aboard the boat either as inshore fishermen or as trawlermen aboard merchant vessels. Women and men alike worked in the plants, processing, salting, freezing, and boxing fish for export. Plant workers were not protected by minimum wage laws. Wages were miserable and working conditions harsh. For the fish harvester, the company set the prices, and the harvester's only choices were to go fishing or stay home. It was dangerous work for meager earnings. The harvesters were at the mercy of the merchants, who looked down upon and exploited those who made them wealthy. For the necessities of everyday life that they could not produce for themselves, they depended on the merchant who sold them their gear in the spring, bought their fish in the fall, and sold their supplies for the winter. Living under this system, most families rarely saw actual cash from their year's labor. Their lives' fortune or misfortune was but a line on the merchant's ledger. There has been a long desire by fish harvesters in the province to break the shackles put on them by merchants. But by the mid-1960s, nearly 50 years had passed since the last great fish harvester movement. The Fishermen's Protective Union, formed by William Coker, passed into history. In the mid-1960s, Father Des McGrath, a Catholic priest from Cornerbrook, was studying in Nova Scotia and witnessed the success of fish harvesting organizations' efforts in that province. In 1969, Father Des relocated to a parish in Port-au-Choix on the Great Northern Peninsula. He quickly saw the cycle of poverty that fish harvesters and plant workers faced living under the thumb of the merchant. It was during a conversation with 3 long-line skippers, Jean Gould, Ralph O'Keefe, and Robert Spence of Port-au-Choix, that the decision was reached to build a union. They held the first meeting in November of that year in Port-au-Choix, and 69 men attended. They aired their grievances and came up with a plan. But starting a union of fishermen was a complicated affair that needed legal help. So Father Des called upon none other than young Richard Cashin.
When Father McGrath called me and suggested I go to the Northern Peninsula, my first reaction was the middle of winter, and I said, well, I think I'll wait till the summer. And then he said, what about a fisherman's union? And that was like a match to a blasty bow. I mean, it was a magnificent idea, because if anything was really going to change about Newfoundland, it could only change from the bottom up.
Cashin was a St. John's lawyer who hailed from a family with a history steeped in St. John's politics. Only 25 when he was elected as a Member of Parliament for St. John's West in 1962, he held the seat until 1968. After his stint in the House of Commons, Cashin started his law practice by representing fish harvesters in Placentia Bay in a lawsuit against the Electric Reduction Company at Long Harbour for polluting the water and fish with phosphorus. He won a substantial settlement for those harvesters, and in the process learned the struggles of fishing families on the south coast of the province. The win also gained him the respect of fishermen far and wide. Grandson of Sir Michael Cashin, once Prime Minister of Newfoundland, nephew of Major Peter Cashin, who led anti-Confederation forces in 1948, and son of a businessman, Richard Cashin was an unlikely choice to lead efforts for a fish harvester union. But it was Cashin's tenacious leadership that provided the impetus needed to unite isolated communities across the province. That winter, Cashin connected with Father Des on the Northern Peninsula, and the two got to work forming a union. Discontent was brewing in fishing communities around the province, and it wasn't long before word of Cashin's involvement spread. On April 25, 1970, 200 fishermen met again in Port au Choix, where the Northern Fishermen's Union was formed. The members spanned from Port Saunders through Port au Choix to Bartlett's Harbour as far north as Anchor Point. The union had also signed up most of the workers in the Port au Choix processing plant. Support from the Amalgamated Meat Cutters International Union in Chicago gave the union start up the financial and personnel backing needed to go beyond the Northern Peninsula. As word traveled and other regions and workplaces were interested in joining the union. With that extra support, Cashin and others traversed coastal communities around Newfoundland and Labrador, and it wasn't long before thousands more cards were signed. The first Constitutional Convention was held 50 years ago, in April of 1971, where the Newfoundland Fishermen Food and Allied Workers Union was officially formed. Richard Cashin was elected president, and Kevin Condon, a Calvert fish harvester and union founder, was elected vice president. The merchants were now being challenged on several fronts, and the union's first major battle was brewing on the island's south coast. The Battle of Burgeo would set the stage for a new era in Newfoundland and Labrador history, and a new future for the fishing industry. Spencer Lake came from Fortune, where his father owned several successful businesses in the fishery. In the early 1950s, Premier Smallwood approached Lake to take over the struggling fish freezing plant in Burgeo, owned by Fishery Products Limited. With the promise of substantial government assistance, Lake agreed. At the time, Burgeo had a population of about 1,000 people. There were no roads in or out, no sanitation system, no municipal government, and the town was severely lacking in services. The Lake set up a grocery store, a barber shop, beauty parlor, and brought in dairy cattle to provide the town with fresh milk. Spencer Lake even formed municipal government and made himself mayor. Pretty soon, the Lakes monopolized every aspect of life in Burgeo. Spencer Lake, you see, firmly believed the people of Burgeo were unable to make decisions for themselves.
I think here in Burgeo and the small fishing outports around Newfoundland, I don't think unions have a place. I don't think they work very well. So the
When efforts began to organize the plant in Burgeo, Lake threatened to sell the plant and abandon the town if workers went ahead. They voted to join the union anyway. The tensions mounted as weeks turned into months, and the whole industry waited to see whether the new union would stand or fall in the face of adversity.
This is very much a fight for man's dignity and his rights.
With an election underway, Premier Smallwood refused to step in. Conservative leader Frank Moores promised to settle the dispute if elected, and when Moores became Premier, he kept his promise by having the government buy the plant. The strike ended, and in March of 1972, the first collective agreement was signed. It was a landmark victory for the new union and showed workers everywhere the power of a strong union. But Burgeo was only one part of a revolutionary 1971. That same year, the union successfully lobbied the Smallwood government to pass the Fishing Industry Collective Bargaining Act. It was the last piece of legislation Smallwood would pass, and it was the first time that the collective bargaining rights of harvesters were acknowledged in Canada. Also in 1971, Ray Greening was elected Secretary-Treasurer after playing a pivotal role in managing Burgeo through their labour dispute. From 1971 onwards, the union transformed the face of the fishery in this province. In 1973, a breakthrough collective agreement with BC Packers in Harbour Breton brought a significant improvement to wages, benefits, and contract language for fish plant workers, setting the stage for other unionized plants around the province. In 1974, inshore harvesters on the Northern Peninsula tied up for higher fish prices, with South Coast trawlermen tying up in support. The trawlermen then stayed tied up to push their own demands. To get trawlers back to sea, the provincial government appointed a conciliation board chaired by Dr. Leslie Harris to look into the dispute between trawlermen and trawler operators. Harris authored a comprehensive report recommending fundamental change to the relationship between trawlermen and the companies, and as a result, trawlermen saw their incomes double nearly overnight. In 1978, the union successfully lobbied the federal government to provide offshore shrimp licenses for the people on the Labrador coast. The union held a public meeting in Labrador that led to the creation of the Labrador Fishermen's Union Shrimp Company. The community-owned company provides economic stability, good jobs to the people on the coast of Labrador to this day, and has diversified beyond shrimp. In 1980, the union experienced a terrible loss with the sudden death of Ray Greening at only 43 years old. Richard Cashin called Greening the best organizer Newfoundland and Labrador ever had, and his death was a profound loss to the FFAW and the labour community. Union Forum editor Earl McCurdy stepped up to take the position of Secretary-Treasurer. Not long after, the union launched a major campaign to win workers' compensation for fish harvesters. In 1981, the provincial government agreed to the union's demands and designated buyers as employers of fish harvesters under the Workers' Compensation Act.
We have to let the politicians know that this is an issue they're going to have to talk about. They're going to have to address. And if they don't address it, then we will have to change and to take direct political action.
The 1984 Unity Campaign further strengthened the solidarity between trawlermen, fish harvesters and plant workers to negotiate fair contracts with adequate wages. In 1987, the FFAW left the UFCW to join the Canadian Auto Workers Union. The new parent union leveraged new gains for collective bargaining and saw improvements to wages and benefits for plant workers. But as the 1980s wound down, the first serious signs of trouble were emerging in the northern cod fishery. Inshore catch rates began to decline significantly, even though scientists at the time indicated the stock was still growing. The concerns of fish harvesters were repeatedly dismissed. In 1990, cod landings continued to decline and plants started closing. The union led protests and rallies calling attention to foreign overfishing, but the damage was already done. On July 2, 1992, the province entered a new, uncertain era that would again transform the province. The term moratorium was about to be embedded in our lives.
To safeguard the northern cod as a species, I've decided that effective at midnight tonight, there will be a moratorium on harvesting of northern cod until the spring of 1994.
Nearly 40,000 people lost their jobs the day John Crosbie announced the moratorium on northern cod. To this day, it remains the single largest layoff in Canadian history. In the days, weeks, months, and years that followed, the FFAW, under the leadership of Richard Cashin and Earl McCurdy, guided the fishing industry through the most challenging hardship most families had ever had to endure.
And today we have run out of fish, and the federal government insults us by offering us a package that is based upon the non-union minimum wage worker and then says we'll work it out with you. Well, that's not good enough. The most important thing that Canada has to do is to do what it takes to manage the fishery right to the end of the continental shelf.
Sometimes you got to take action. That action's got to be taken by the people themselves, and today is a part of the process of taking that important action.
The union fought back against federal government's measly compensation plan and achieved a better benefits package to help those who had lost their livelihoods overnight. With cod and other groundfish stocks effectively eliminated, the landscape of the inshore fishery had to be reimagined, but this time it would not be under the leadership of Union stalwart Richard Cashin. In 1993, after 23 years as President, Cashin announced his retirement, replaced by Earl McCurdy. McCurdy led the industry through those challenging years following the moratorium, and he was at the helm in 1995 when the Canadian government engaged in a turbulent war with Spain, as heavy overfishing by foreign vessels continued on the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. The same year, the FFAW launched the Sentinel Cod program in collaboration with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Harvesters' observations were ignored at the onset of the collapse of northern cod, so the objective of Sentinel was to give harvesters their rightful seat at the assessment table. In 1997, the Union was successful in lobbying for access to northern shrimp for the under 65-foot fleet. Access to this new resource provided new opportunities for the fleet and for plant workers and their communities. In 1998, the federal government attempted to cancel the Atlantic groundfish strategy, known as the TAGS program.
Well, if tags are cut off in August, I doubt if this store will see December. I doubt it very much.
We're here tonight practically begging.
Does anybody care? Especially Ottawa.
We've been trying to get a meeting with the Cabinet Committee that deals with tags, and so far to no avail.
I don't think a series of protests throughout Newfoundland and Labrador are really going to solve anything.
Don't assume that this is a bit of a posture. Now I'm getting on TV and saying this is going to happen. This is serious stuff. People who made a real good living at one time are sitting back, and they're being abandoned and let down the drain, and they are not going to go without a fight.
The Union staged a 2-day protest at Revenue Canada Centre on the income tax filing deadline, leading the government to announce $760 million for the post-tags funding.
Brothers and our sisters, many far off lands, there is power in our union.
In 2005, without warning, the provincial government announced a 2-year pilot project, a plant production quota system called raw material sharing. RMS, as it was known, would sway power in favour of processing companies.
How much hardship is the Premier of our province prepared to impose on outport Newfoundlanders and Labradorians to satisfy his own ego?
No, I won't back down. You can stand me up at the gates of hell, but
We drove all night to get here.
back down. No, I stand my ground. Won't be turned around.
The Union reacted strongly with a major fight-back campaign,
From dragging me down.
and eventually the province withdrew the project entirely.
And I won't back down. Hey, baby.
The settlement of RMS brought significant change to the fishery. In 2006, the province amended the Fishing Industry Collective Bargaining Act and established a standing fish price-setting panel. Now, harvesters sit as equals with the processors and are protected against the heavy-handed tactics the processors had employed in the past. In 2011 saw the introduction of the lobster price formula, fought for by the FFAW Lobster Negotiating Committee. Lobster buyers tried to force harvesters to sell for lower prices by locking them out. Fish harvesters around the province were not going to back down, so the FFAW organised a co-op to ship and market their own lobster. It worked. Buyers resumed buying according to the market-based formula. Despite these numerous attempts by lobster buyers to abolish it, the pricing formula has led to a price increase of nearly 200% in the last 10 years. In 2013, the Newfoundland and Labrador Gulf halibut fishery was a dangerous 48-hour derby fishery. Not only was it incredibly unsafe, but the approach was also bad for conservation and prices. In 2012, the entire quota was overrun in just 29 hours. The market was flooded in a single day, leading to poor prices for harvesters. The union pushed for a new way of doing things that would make fishing safer for our members and provide long-term value and sustainability for the halibut fishery. The prices speak for themselves. Since the new plan started, prices paid to harvesters have almost doubled. In 2012, the union played an integral role in the formation of the Canadian Independent Fish Harvesters Federation, a national voice for owner-operator fisheries that helped pave the way for owner-operator and fleet separation policies to be written into law. The small-scale makeup of our fishery is the economic backbone of our province and provides wealth and sustainability to entire communities. Controlling agreements are the greatest threat against the sustainability of the inshore fishery in Newfoundland and Labrador. These agreements use legal loopholes to avoid the owner-operator and fleet separation policies to the detriment of inshore fishers and their communities. They disrupt every aspect of the inshore fishery, from pricing to youth participation. For decades, the FFAW has advocated for changes to legislation that will protect the owner-operator inshore fishery. The federal government finally passed Bill C-68 in 2020, giving DFO Minister the power to make regulations to protect independence of license holders in commercial inshore fisheries. Now we are working with government to enforce these regulations to put law into practice. These changes are a testament to what can be accomplished when inshore fish harvesters have a strong and united voice on an issue. It is proof that our efforts are worthwhile. The FFAW has been leading the fight for safety for our members. In 2012, the union was a key partner in the formation of the Newfoundland and Labrador Fish Harvesting Safety Association, and again in 2019 with the creation of the Manufacturing and Processing Safety Sector Council for fish processing workers. Also in 2012, members of the OCI trawler, the Lynx, were locked out by their employer. The union stood strong and stopped scab workers from taking our members' jobs, eventually coming to an agreement that made meaningful gains for the trawler workers. In 2013, we became FFAW-Unifor, when our national union, the Canadian Auto Workers, merged with the Communications, Energy and Paper Workers Union of Canada. The FFAW was not only the largest trade union in Newfoundland and Labrador, we now leverage the largest private sector union in Canada. The following year, in 2014, Earl McCurdy announced his retirement after 21 years as the face of the FFAW.
Earl has shown that with hard work, smarts, consensus building, and strong leadership, that we can make things better for working people and their families.
It was a few weeks later when I was elected to replace him. The son of a fish harvester from Calvert, I grew up aboard my father's boat, fishing through university until I found myself working for the union. My being elected as president represented an important generational change, not just for the union, but for the industry as a whole. I'm proud of the work that we have accomplished in the years since. In 2016, the outlook for northern shrimp was bleak as our oceans transition and northern cod and other groundfish species recover. The last in, first out policy would have resulted in inshore fish harvesters and plant workers being pushed out of the northern shrimp fishery. Entire communities would have faced immediate devastation, and the effects would have been far-reaching.
We got to stand up for the principles of adjacency, and we got to remain united.
I'm a proud Newfoundlander and I'm a proud fisherman. Newfoundland is the fishery. It's been here a long time, and we're proud of it.
The FFAW stood its ground, and in one of the union's largest campaigns in years, we united our members and entire communities to successfully abolish LIFO. Since 2014, our locals in Long Harbour have seen remarkable growth. Our skilled trades local performs maintenance work in all aspects of the nickel smelter's operations in Long Harbour. As production ratchets up, our membership grows. We've increased from 12 to 170 workers with the potential to employ even more. But it hasn't been an easy road for some of those workers. The janitorial staff at Provincial Ready Mix, the contractor hired by Valet, underwent a 6-year battle with their employer just to negotiate their first collective agreement. In the end, the workers' perseverance and solidarity paid off. The 21 employees all shared a $225,000 signing bonus.
Are you ready to fight?
In 2019, plant workers and fish harvesters rallied together in St. John's to push back against DFO's plan to significantly reduce crab quotas.
We're not going to stand by and let them destroy our community.
Minister Jonathan Wilkinson and Justin Trudeau, we're going to be heard. Fight back.
Then, in the spring of 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic reached Newfoundland and Labrador. It was a time of fear and uncertainty for our members as we had to rapidly shift many of the ways we live and work. Seemingly overnight, millions of people worldwide lost their jobs. Our members were not unaffected. The service industry, particularly workplaces like Quality Hotel and Suites in Gander and the Ramada in St. John's, have faced an incredibly trying 2 years as they deal with the fallout of a nearly non-existent tourism industry. Members in all of our workplaces, whether on ocean-going tankers, Molson Brewery, fish plants, or metal fabrication shops, were challenged by COVID-19, and our union in all of these workplaces led the charge in safety when confronted with the unprecedented global health crisis. Usually, the spring is a busy time of year for the fishing industry. Our inshore members are busy gearing up and negotiating committees are hard at work setting minimum prices for the upcoming season. But COVID-19 had significant impacts on the market for seafood internationally, which had a profound impact on the inshore fishery here in Newfoundland and Labrador. Enterprise owners and crew members were also rightfully worried about safety, working in close quarters aboard a small fishing vessel at a time when we still knew very little about the coronavirus. Our union insisted on safe opening protocols for both inshore fish harvesters and plant workers. After a 5-week delay, the fishery eventually opened, and we are all thankful that there were no outbreaks on any of our fishing vessels or processing plants. That fall, we had another change in leadership when David Decker retired as Secretary-Treasurer after 17 years in the role and over 30 with the FFAW. Being replaced by Robert Keenan, who has extensive experience as a lawyer and as a lead negotiator for the union in the last several years. We will always face challenges, but as we have done for the last 50 years, we will continue to stand up for workers, for safety, for good jobs and fair wages. We fight for a sustainable future for our children and grandchildren. 5 decades have come and gone since the Fish, Food and Allied Workers was first formed. In those 50 years, the landscape of our province has changed more significantly than we ever could have imagined. But together, we have built an institution in Newfoundland and Labrador based on hard work and commitment, and not on privilege and exploitation. There are no easy fixes when it comes to the challenges we face, but we know that when we work together in solidarity, we can achieve remarkable things. We must continue to innovate provide a voice for our members as we look towards the future, creating a vision and a plan for the next 50 years and beyond. For our communities, our families, our workplaces, our union.